rubble from some 170,000 buildings damaged in the war in Gaza is more than just a humanitarian concern. It's also an environmental one.
What the likelihood that there may be storage of chemicals, fuel tanks, or other materials that may then cause contamination. The environmental quality of existing groundwater supplies are already poor, and that's been exacerbated by the current conflict.
Scientists are trying to assess the environmental impacts of the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. Studies include war-related forest fires and pollution from weapons, significant threats to humans, wildlife and ecosystems in Ukraine, researchers warn.
Any ordnance which is explosive, when it explodes, it can start off new fires and it definitely produces more chemicals which come out.
Separate researchers in Europe, the UK and the US are making pioneering efforts to measure war-related greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to climate change.
Greenhouse gas emissions you don't measure directly, so you derive them from amount of fuel that has been used or the amount of fire. So we have different kind of sources.
One peer-reviewed study conducted inside Ukraine says the first 18 months of war produced more greenhouse gases than the annual emissions of Austria, Portugal or Hungary. But the lack of international guidelines to measure emissions from conflict, the limited opportunities for field research, and the secrecy surrounding military operations mean that estimates are not always precise or conclusive. Nonetheless, those making them argue they are important to better understand and improve the global fight against climate change.
If we haven't learned anything over the past few years, extreme weather events from floods to extreme temperatures to a whole host of salinity problems, this is at our front door.
Holding climate polluters accountable remains a challenge. Under the current international reporting system, countries report the greenhouse gas emissions produced in their own territory. There are no formal guidelines to measure those emissions from a conflict or a legal framework to attribute responsibility.
International efforts will be needed from scientists, policymakers to develop some new guidelines.
The U.S. military backs the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, but the Pentagon says it takes the threat from climate change seriously. Press Secretary Major General Pat Ryder told VOA.
When it comes to climate change and the effect of climate change, the department has been very clear to include referencing it in our national defense strategy that we as a U.S. military need to adapt and be ready to address the kinds of challenges that climate change presents.
Researchers underline that while mitigating environmental and climate change impacts must remain a top concern, addressing the humanitarian crisis and civilian suffering in war zones must also take precedence. Veronica, Balderas, Iglesiashas, VOA News, Washington.